I always wanted to get away from the noise of the city, so I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week. It was a simple wooden cabin, sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and that was just how I liked it. The first few days were perfect. I hiked, read books, and enjoyed the quiet. At night, I would sit by the fireplace, listening to the crackling logs and the far-off sounds of animals in the dark. It was exactly what I needed. On the fourth night, as I was falling asleep, I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I told myself it was just an animal and tried to ignore it. But the noise got louder and wouldn't stop. My heart started beating faster. I got up and looked out the window but saw nothing in the darkness. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin. They were human, and they hadn't been there the day before. A shiver ran down my back. I decided to stay inside that day, keeping the doors locked and the windows shut. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, the sounds came back. This time, they were closer, right outside the cabin walls. I was terrified. I could hear heavy breathing, footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. It felt like someone was trying to get in. I stayed up all night, holding a kitchen knife, my eyes fixed on the door. By morning, the noises had stopped, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. As I stepped outside, I saw something new, a piece of paper pinned to the front door. It had one word written on it in large, messy letters. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw my bags in the car and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the familiar sounds of cars and people. Later, I found out that there had been reports of strange activities in those woods, but no one had been able to find out who or what was behind them. It was a mystery that no one could solve. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear those same noises outside my window. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in those woods. Some places are meant to be left alone, and I learned that the hard way. But sometimes I wonder if whatever was out there has followed me back to the city, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I'm never truly safe. I decided to take a break from city life and rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to disconnect and find some quiet. The cabin was old but sturdy, hidden between tall trees, miles away from the nearest town. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time reading, hiking, and enjoying the sounds of nature. But on the third night, things started to feel off. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a faint rustling outside. It could have been an animal, so I ignored it. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They were human, not animal. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window. My heart raced as I realized someone had been watching me while I slept. I locked all the doors and windows, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, I kept a flashlight and a kitchen knife by my bed. The rustling returned, louder this time, and then came a soft tapping on the window. I held my breath, too scared to move. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I found more footprints, closer to the cabin. Whoever it was had tried the door. Panic set in, and I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. As I loaded the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt near the cabin was a fresh set of footprints, leading into the woods. They were larger, heavier, and headed in the direction I was planning to drive. I got into the car, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, constantly checking the rearview mirror. About a mile down the road, I saw a figure standing in the distance, blocking the path. It was a tall man, dressed in dark clothes, staring directly at me. I floored the gas pedal, heart pounding, and the man stepped aside at the last moment, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I reported the incident to the local cops. but they didn't find anyone matching my description. They told me the woods had a history of strange happenings, and advised me not to return. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of those nights still haunts me. I often wonder who was out there, watching me, and what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that tall man, and I can't help but feel like he's still out there, waiting. And every time I hear a rustle or a tap at my window, I'm reminded of how close I came to meeting him face to face. The peace I sought in the woods turned into a nightmare that follows me wherever I go. I got to the cabin just before dark. It stood alone in the woods, far from the nearest town. The place was so quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I came here to escape the city's noise, to find some peace. But as the darkness grew, so did my worry. The cabin was old and creaky. I unpacked my stuff and tried to settle in, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I told myself it was just nerves and being tired from the long drive. Night fell, and I lit a fire in the fireplace. The warmth and light were nice, but the shadows seemed to move in strange ways. I brushed it off, blaming my imagination. I ate a simple dinner and decided to go to bed early. I locked the front door and checked all the windows. Everything was secure. I crawled into bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder in the silence. I told myself it was just the old wood settling. In the middle of the night I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from outside the bedroom window. My heart pounded as I lay there, listening. I gathered the courage to get up and look. I pulled the curtain aside, and there was nothing but darkness. I stood there for a while, staring into the black, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or an animal. I went back to bed, but the scratching continued. It wouldn't stop. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, so I got up and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I decided to face whatever it was. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting me like a slap. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the yard. The light caught movement near the edge of the forest. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to see, but it was too dark. The light only showed a small area, leaving most of the surroundings in shadow. I slowly walked toward the noise, each step feeling heavier than the last. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I finally reached the spot where I thought it was coming from. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small metal box. I crouched down, my hands shaking, and dug it out. The box was old and rusty, but it wasn't locked. I opened it and found a bunch of items, photos, letters, and a small, worn-out journal. I looked through the letters and photos. They belonged to a family who once lived here. The journal entries were disturbing. They detailed a series of strange things happening, much like what I had experienced. The family had left in a hurry, never to return. The last entry was a warning to anyone who found the box. "Leave while you can. It's not safe here." I stood there, the weight of the box in my hands, understanding now why the cabin felt wrong. I didn't need any more convincing. I ran back inside, grabbed my things, and drove away, leaving the cabin and its secrets behind. As I sped down the dark road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent, the forest around it still. But I knew deep down that whatever was there wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was better left alone. Days later, back in the city, I still couldn't shake the feeling. Every night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard that same scratching sound. It followed me, a reminder that some things, once found, can never be left behind. I needed a break from my busy life, so I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a few days. It was a small, cozy place with wooden walls and a fireplace. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the quietness was just what I needed. On the second night, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It sounded like branches snapping underfoot. I sat up in bed, listening. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. I told myself not to worry and tried to go back to sleep. But the noise continued. I got out of bed, put on my shoes, and grabbed a flashlight. I opened the door slowly, the cold air hitting me immediately. I shined the light around but saw nothing. The forest was dark and dense, the trees casting long shadows. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the side of the cabin. I walked slowly, my heart pounding. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. Around the corner, I saw something that made me freeze. There were footprints in the dirt, but they weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they were fresh. My mind raced. I was supposed to be alone out here. I followed the tracks a few more steps and then stopped. There, nailed to the side of the cabin, was a small, weathered piece of paper. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. I reached out, my fingers shaking, and pulled it down. In the beam of the flashlight, I read the message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Leave now." I didn't wait to find out who left it or why. I ran back inside, locked the door, and packed my things as quickly as I could. The noise outside started up again, louder and more insistent. I could hear footsteps now, moving around the cabin. I grabbed my keys and dashed to my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow dirt road, not looking back. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still pounding when I reached the main road. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I don't know who left that note or what their intentions were, but I never went back to that cabin. The peace and quiet I wanted turned into a night of terror, and I was just glad to get out of there alive. It was a weekend getaway from the city, a tiny, old cabin tucked away in the woods. I rented it to escape the usual noise and stress. The cabin was basic, a small kitchen, a few worn-out chairs, and a bed that squeaked every time I moved. It had a certain old-fashioned charm, a quiet peace that helped me relax. On the second night, as I was about to go to sleep, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked tightly before, was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it. I went over and checked. It closed with a click. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind. The cabin's solitude was both its best and worst feature. The nearest neighbor was miles away. As I lay in bed, I heard noises outside, soft rustling and the occasional snap of a twig. I told myself it was probably an animal. But the sounds seemed to get closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. I decided to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The moonlight shone through the trees, making spooky shadows. I walked around the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe I was just getting spooked by the quiet. Back inside, I checked all the windows and doors again. Everything seemed locked up tight. I climbed back into bed, trying to ignore the creeping unease. But the noises continued, closer now, more deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, was moving around the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and holding it tightly, I stepped outside once more. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, showing only trees and bushes. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. Feeling a bit foolish, I went back inside and locked the door again. I put the poker next to my bed and tried to get some sleep. The noises stopped after a while, and eventually, I was so tired that I fell asleep. The next morning, I saw fresh tracks around the cabin, footprints in the mud, leading away from the front door. They were large and deep, not like any animal tracks I'd seen before. My heart raced as I realized these tracks weren't from any animal. Someone had been trying to get in. I packed my stuff quickly, eager to leave. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees seemed to close in on it, as if hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, as I drove further away, I noticed something chilling in my rearview mirror. In the distance, by the cabin, a figure stood watching me leave. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape standing still. My heart pounded as I realized that figure hadn't been there when I first left. I sped up, not daring to look back again. I had no intention of ever returning. The cabin was meant to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the noise of city life. Hidden deep in the woods, it promised quiet and seclusion. As I drove along the narrow, twisting road, the trees grew thicker, their shadows reaching out like long fingers in the fading light. When I finally got there, the cabin looked just like I had hoped, simple and cozy, with a welcoming porch and smoke curling from the chimney. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace, opened a book, and enjoyed the quiet of the forest. But as night fell, the stillness seemed to grow heavier. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the leaves outside seemed louder than usual. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. The second night, things took a turn. I woke suddenly, not to the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, but to something more deliberate. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and steady, moving around the outside of the cabin. My heart raced as I listened, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination. The footsteps kept going, slow and rhythmic, as though someone was patrolling around the cabin. I carefully got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and peeked out the windows. Everything seemed normal. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal wandering by. I went back to bed, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued throughout the night, coming closer and closer to the walls of the cabin. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were no signs of animals or anything unusual in the dirt. I felt uneasy but decided to stay one more night, hoping it was just my nerves getting the best of me. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, I decided to take action. I grabbed a small axe from the shed and went outside to check things out. The forest was pitch black, and the only sounds were my breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I followed the noise, moving carefully through the underbrush. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold, fresh footprints leading up to the back of the cabin, and they weren't mine. They were bigger and wider, with deep, dragging impressions that suggested someone had been walking with a limp or dragging a foot. I hurried back to the cabin and locked all the doors. The footsteps grew louder, now joined by a scraping sound against the walls. I held my breath, gripping the axe tightly, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what might be outside. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. For a few moments, there was silence before I heard the sound of someone, or something, breaking through the cabin's back door. The door was weak, and I could hear it splintering under pressure. I knew I had to act quickly. With my heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and called the local sheriff, my hands shaking as I described the situation. I stayed on the line, listening to the frantic sounds of someone, or something, moving around inside the cabin. The sheriff arrived within minutes, finding me huddled in the corner of the main room. The back door was shattered, and the inside of the cabin was a mess. But there was no sign of anyone. No footprints led away from the cabin, and no evidence of anyone forcing entry beyond the broken door. The sheriff searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. They told me that someone might have been trying to scare me, but there was no real danger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister had happened. As I packed up my things and left the cabin, the forest seemed darker and more threatening. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The light from my car headlights briefly illuminated something chilling. 2 sets of fresh footprints leading away from the back of the cabin, disappearing into the woods. The tracks were clear, but what really scared me was the third set, fainter, almost dragging, and moving in the opposite direction, back toward the cabin. I never went back, and I still can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still watching, waiting for its next chance. The drive to the cabin was boring, just a long road with trees on both sides. I had rented the place for the weekend to get away from the city and clear my mind. It was remote and perfect for some peace and quiet. When I got there, the cabin looked like no one had been there for years. The paint was peeling, and the windows were covered in dust. Inside, it was even worse. The furniture was old and worn out, and there was a musty smell in the air. I told myself it added to the charm and tried not to let it bother me. The first night was quiet. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. The silence was almost too much compared to the constant noise of the city, but I eventually fell asleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small lake nearby, and I spent the afternoon fishing and enjoying the peace. As the sun started to set, I went back to the cabin. That night, things started to feel off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud bang. My heart was pounding as I listened for any other sounds. After a few minutes of silence, I told myself it was just an animal outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found the front door open. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. I checked the cabin but didn't find anything out of place. Trying to shake off the creepy feeling, I spent the day hiking and taking photos of the area. That night, the feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. I couldn't shake it, even though I didn't see anyone. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before going to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow and careful, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, trying to hear more. The footsteps stopped at the front door, then moved to the windows. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it outside, but I saw nothing. I barely slept that night, jumping at every noise. When the sun finally came up, I decided I had enough. I packed my things and loaded the car, ready to leave. As I walked to the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt around the cabin were footprints, but they weren't mine. They were bigger, heavier, and fresh. Someone had been watching me, walking around the cabin while I slept. I got in the car and drove away as fast as I could. I never told anyone about it. But I knew that someone had been out there, watching and waiting. Sometimes I still think about it, especially when I'm alone at night. The idea that someone could be out there, hiding in the dark, ready to step out when you least expect it, still haunts me.